Biology 1108, Presentation Number 1, Origins of Life. The current accepted notion of the origins of life, the explanation is provided by Darwinian evolution. That's the current scientific explanation. However, there are plenty of other explanations for the origins of life, and our job in this presentation is to identify those and take a look at them. And we're going to see that while Darwinian evolution is the accepted explanation, and it's the one that we're going to be spending most time focusing on in the succeeding presentations in Biology 1108, we need to get a handle on exactly what these other explanations are. So we're going to begin with a series of slides that will look up pre-Darwinian notions of origins of life, those explanations that date previous to the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. Every culture on this planet, from the beginning, has had a creation story. The creation story generally involves some kind of supernatural deity or deities responsible for the creation of the planet and the population of that planet with animals, plants, and, most importantly, people. We're going to refer to this as special creation. It's what we commonly refer to as creationism when we think of the Judeo-Christian tradition in terms of the creation story found in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. But in all of these cases, every single one of these special creation explanations involve a number of different assumptions. First off, the earth is relatively young. Second, once species are created by that deity or deities, the species do not change. They are described as being immutable. So for every single culture on the face of the planet, there is a creation story that essentially is characterized by these bullet points. With the rise of sciences, particularly in Western cultures, there became a renewed interest in explanations for the origins of the earth and the origins of diversity in biology. And this particular drive led to an initial suggestion, which was proposed by a fellow by the name of Georges Cuvier in the late 18th century. That's the 1700s. He was a Frenchman, and it was a proposal called catastrophism. Now, Cuvier was a scientist who was very much interested in fossils. The study of fossils is called paleontology. And in looking at fossils, he reasoned that there were probably mass extinction events that led to the deaths of all of these organisms he saw in these fossils. He wasn't so terribly far off. Turns out that there is a plenty of evidence to suggest there were mass extinctions over the history of our planet. And the idea is that, of course, that after these mass extinctions, there was a repopulation of the earth from those individuals that survived. And so we had loss of individuals that were no longer seen and repopulation of the planet that leads to the diversity that we see today. Now, also in the 17th century, there was another French fellow by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And he was looking at fossils as well, but he came at a different suggestion from a completely different standpoint. He was looking at these fossils and noticed there seemed to be evidence of a succession of life forms as you moved from progressively older fossils to more recent fossils. You could actually describe certain features in these organisms that were changing over time. Case in point, we're looking at a series of illustrations showing me some ancestral giraffes. At the very bottom of the illustration, you will see a giraffe over on the left. But basically, as you look at the series of illustrations progressing from the top to the bottom, you will see that there seems to be a process by which the long neck for the giraffe seemed to be selected for. But it's important to understand exactly where Lamarck was coming from. His idea was the idea that a giraffe made a distinct decision to stretch its neck to reach those leaves. By stretching its neck to reach those leaves on the left, you will see that the giraffe actually manages to get that nutrition, and as a consequence reinforces the fact that its neck is long. So it stretches its neck, and that's an acquired characteristic. And that acquired characteristic is passed on to its offspring. It's the idea that the giraffe stretches its neck. Its babies have long necks, and they stretch their necks, and their babies have long necks. Now, it's a basic difference between Lamarck and Darwin's idea, which is where, by virtue of having a long neck, which is genetically programmed, the genes are then selected for and passed on to future generations. In this case, it has nothing to do with genes. It has to do with the decision of the giraffe to stretch its neck and therefore pass that particular trait as an acquired characteristic on to future generations. That is Lamarckian evolution. Okay, well, at this point, we'll take a look at what constitutes Darwinian evolution, which is obviously the accepted explanation for variation in organisms today. It is the origin of species, to coin a phrase that Darwin applied to his original book on the subject. Charles Darwin was originally a young fella studying to become a physician. He was not terribly convinced he wanted to become a physician. He was interested in science, and he therefore took a position as a naturalist on a British sailing ship called the HMS Beagle. Turns out that his uncle was the captain. Now, as a naturalist on a British ship at that time, the expectation was that as this ship traveled across the face of the planet, and you were typically looking at a voyage of anywhere from 2 to 8 or even 10 years, you were going to be obligated to collect, describe, and illustrate all of these organisms that you were seeing at these various unique places. That's the job of the naturalist. Now, the fact of the matter is the British Empire was not doing this because they were interested in acquiring new information. They were interested in acquiring resources and products that they could exploit. The idea was if they could establish the fact that this far distant place has organisms and resources that they could be able to mine or extract or kill or sell, that would be much better for them. So that was the general idea. The British Empire was in expansion mode, and naturalists were an important part of that basic idea. Bottom line is Darwin, as a young fella in the 1830s, took on this job as a naturalist on this boat called the HMS Beagle. And if you look at the illustration at the lower left, you will see that it left England and literally traveled all around the world. It took 5 years. And during that 5 years, Charles Darwin collected a heck of a lot of information and developed a tremendous number of ideas, which he took home with him, and over the next 20 to 30 years developed into this idea that we're going to refer to as evolution by natural selection. Well, let's take a look at some of the ideas that influenced Darwin's thinking on this. On his voyage, he observed organisms that were demonstrating change over many generations. He would see birds, he would see plants, he would see reptiles, and in each of these cases, these species seemed to have demonstrated some degree of change that led to specific specializations that meant that that bird or that reptile or that plant might better survive in its particular situation. Now, couple this with the fact that Charles Darwin was not ignorant of this idea of paleontology. We've already taken a look at two guys, Lamarck and Cuvier, who basically recognized that paleontology was a key to understanding the changes that lead to the variation that we see today. So Charles Darwin was aware of the fossil record. He was aware of the fact that the fossil record provides us with evidence of new species, and that evidence also provides us changes that occurred within groups of organisms. So in his mind, Charles Darwin was developing this idea that there was change occurring over generations in species to result in the changes that we see today that essentially mean that a particular species is best matched to its environment and its situation. Now, it turns out that there was another young fella at this time. Now, I guess I have to say it wasn't another young fella, because at the time that Charles Darwin was finally formulating his ideas concerning evolution, he was in his 50s or maybe his 60s. So it had been 30 years since he was sailing around on this ship as a younger man. Well, along comes this fellow named Alfred Russel Wallace, who was basically doing the same thing Charles Darwin did. He traveled to a lot of foreign and, exotic places and was taking a look at organisms and recognized some of the exact same things. Now, Charles Darwin was relatively famous, and he was not famous at that point for the notion of evolution, but he was relatively famous for a lot of other scientific things. He had a lot of projects going on. He published a lot of books, and he published a lot of papers. And Alfred Russel Wallace, as a younger man, maybe in his late 20s, early 30s, was a big fan of Charles Darwin. He writes him a letter. He says, "Mr. Darwin, I really am awed by you, and I need to share you some information. I want to know what you think." And in this letter, Alfred Russel Wallace laid out his idea of how organisms seem to adapt for life in their particular situation. Now, I set off a warning bell for Charles Darwin, because he's looking at this letter written by this young fellow who's 30 years younger than he is, and he's realizing this guy's got the same idea I've been working on over the last 30 years. So Charles Darwin kind of writes him back a polite letter and says, "That's a great idea, but I don't think it's going to come of much, but stay in touch." In the meantime, Charles Darwin turns around and very quickly writes this book that we now know as On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Published in 1859, it is like the watershed moment in biology when Darwinian evolution got introduced to the scientific world. Arguably, Alfred Russel Wallace should have been part of that, but the fact of the matter is Charles Darwin was the one that first came up with the basic idea, and he was the one that published the book, and as a consequence, it is now referred to as Darwinian evolution, although most scientists do realize that Alfred Russel Wallace probably should share some degree of double booking for that theory. So let's take a look at the four conceptual bases behind Darwin's idea of what constitutes evolution by natural selection. As a younger man, he's traveling across the face of the planet. Like I said, he's looking at birds, he's looking at plants, he's looking at reptiles. He's cataloging a lot of characteristics on paper and in his mind, and he comes home to jolly old England, and he assumes the career of a scientist. He is very well respected, and he spends the next 30 years mulling over these four basic ideas. Organisms have variations. Those variations seem to match the environment and the situations in which those organisms live. It seems to be uncanny how they seem to be matched to their situations. Organisms struggle to exist. You gotta be able to survive. You gotta be able to reproduce. That is a struggle. And it's your variations that might make that possible. Now, organisms, therefore, since they do struggle to exist, they differ in something called fitness. Now, most of us have heard of the expression survival of the fittest, and it is often used as a quote of Charles Darwin's. The man never used the phrase survival of the fittest. The idea is that if you're fit, has nothing to do with how strong you are, how fast you are, how intelligent you are, has everything to do if you can survive and if you can reproduce. That is fitness. So as an organism has variations, and the variations might have an impact on the organism's struggle to exist, if it is able to exist, it is able to reproduce, it is able to survive, and if you survive, if you reproduce, you get to pass those variations on to future generations. Now, I will remind you of one thing, and that is in 1859, there was no knowledge of genetics. There was no foundation for the understanding of genes, and that genes can actually be passed down from generation to generation. You remember from an earlier course, you learned that there was this guy named Mendel, an Austrian monk, who grew garden peas and published a paper in 1853. But the fact of the matter is that 1853 paper was not appreciated, not read. Mendel died, and it wasn't until the early 1900s that that paper was rediscovered, republished, and at that point appreciated, primarily because scientists reading that paper realized that this idea of what constitutes genetics was the foundation for what is Darwinian evolution. But we'll understand that when Darwin wrote his book in 1859, there was no concept of genes, and there was no concept of inheritance to that extent. So Darwin recognizes organisms have variations, organisms struggle to exist, organisms differ in their ability to reproduce or even survive, and if they're able to reproduce and if they're able to survive, they will pass those characteristics on to future generations, and therefore the future generations become adapted. They are modified, and they're modified because they are better able to survive and reproduce in the situations in which they live. 4 basic principles Darwin was mulling over for a period of 30 years, and at some point that letter from Alfred Russel Wallace really put him in gear, and he wrote that book on the origin of species by means of natural selection in 1859. So right now we're going to introduce some terms, some concepts that are going to help us understand what this idea of Darwinian evolution by natural selection is all about. This particular slide takes a look at the word adaptation. Adaptation is a word that is commonly bounced about when talking about evolution. And adaptation is any modification that distinctly improves a species' success in its environment, which means it contributes to one of 2 things. An adaptation contributes to your ability to survive, and an adaptation contributes to your ability to reproduce. You could be a cactus plant, and your leaves could be modified as spines. And those spines contribute to your ability to survive and reproduce in your environment. You could be a rattlesnake, and you've got these fangs, and you produce this venom. And the combination of venom and fangs could contribute to your ability to survive, and as a consequence, contribute to your ability to reproduce. You could be a bird that has a weird, funky mating ritual, and that weird, funky mating ritual could contribute to your ability to survive and could contribute to your ability to reproduce and pass those genes on to future generations. So an adaptation is any modification that improves a species' success in its environment And I need you to know that adaptations come in two different types. There are homologous adaptations and analogous adaptations. Now, homologous adaptation is an adaptation that begins with a common structure and modifies it. So, for example, you take a look at tetrapods. Now, the word tetrapod implies a vertebrate with 4 limbs. Mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and even birds. These are vertebrates with 4 limbs. They're tetrapods. Now, our limbs originate embryonically basically the same as any other tetrapod. So what we do with that limb is important. Take a look at the picture here at the bottom of the slide. You will see a human hand. You will see the front paw of a cat. You will see the flipper of a whale. And you will see the wing of a bat. Doesn't matter whether it's a bat wing, the flipper of a whale, or the front leg of a cat, or the arm of a human being. They're all derived from the same basic embryonic origin. Obviously, in the case of the bats, this forelimb has been modified to fly. It becomes a wing. In the case of the whale, the forelimb becomes a fin, becomes a flipper, causes the whale to swim. The foreleg in the cat allows it to run, jump, and pounce and catch things. And at least in the human being's case, our arms allow us to grab things. Those are all very different structures, but they all come from some common origin. That means homologous adaptations have a common evolutionary origin. Now, take a look at the other type of adaptation that's on the bottom right of the slide. These are analogous adaptations. And analogous adaptations are adaptations that have the same basic result, but do not, and I repeat, do not demonstrate evolutionary commonality. They don't necessarily have a common origin. Take a look at the pictures under analogous. I see wings. I see a bat has wings. I see a bird has wings. And I see an insect there has wings as well. And it could be any insect. It could be a butterfly. It could be a moth. It could be a bee. It could be a cicada. But the bottom line is you got wings does not necessarily mean that those wings were evolved from some common origin. Obviously, the wings of a bat, the wings of a bird, the wings of an insect are all derived from different embryonic origins. It's not exactly the same thing as we saw in a homologous situation. So I'm going to tell you this. Homologous adaptations have evolutionary value, but analogous adaptations do not, because analogous adaptations do not necessarily demonstrate evolutionary relatedness. A bat is not related to a bird, is definitely not related to an insect. So what is with this word evolution? Sometimes we bounce around the word evolve to imply the same thing. It implies change. Evolution is change. But now when we think about it specifically from a biological standpoint, it is descent with modification. It's change over time. And that word descent means generation to generation to generation to generation. Evolution does not involve individuals. It involves sequences of generations. And those sequences of generations occur over many, many, many years. As a matter of fact, the far majority of evolutionary processes are considered to have occurred over geologic periods of time, which means hundreds of thousands to millions to hundreds of millions of years. So we've mentioned the term natural selection. We understand that it's part of Darwin's title for his original book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. The implication is that natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. Natural selection is a mechanism of change. Now, I want you to look at this slide here because it's a slide that is really, really good at describing what the process of natural selection is all about. Our first bullet point tells us to think about it this way. Natural selection is a case of, quote, nature selects. What does it select for, Dr. Knauss? It selects for characteristics that determine the best fitness, the best ability of that organism to survive and to reproduce in the environment in which it lives. It selects for the characteristics that are most fit. So let's take a look at this. You will see that the illustration shows me a bunch of circles, some of which are empty, some of which are shaded, some lighter, some darker. Now, in this case, we understand that the circle at the top of the illustration represents an ancestral population. And mutation in that ancestral population results in some degree of variation. These might be rabbits. And some of the rabbits in that population might be white, some might be lighter in color, and some might be dark. Now, let's talk about this population of rabbits living here in northwest Georgia. I dare say a white rabbit probably would not live very long in northwest Georgia. It would not blend in with the scenery. It would stick out like a sore thumb. So any cat, any dog, any other predator wandering through the environment would easily see that rabbit and would eat that rabbit. In eating the rabbit obviously A, would not survive, and B, would not be able to pass on its genes on to future generations. Hence, you look at the illustration and we get to the third row, there's a big red X, indicating that white rabbits probably are not going to get to survive and pass their genes on to future generations. On the other hand, the darker colored rabbits might blend a little bit better in with the scenery and therefore avoid predation, therefore get to survive, therefore get to reproduce, and therefore pass their genes on to future generations. Oh, a little bit later, Dr. Knauss, it looks like maybe even the lighter colored rabbits aren't doing so well either. I see a couple of red X's down a little bit further, but the basic idea is that nature, in this case, is selecting for darker colored phenotypes. Now, you remember, hopefully, from earlier life, that the word phenotype is the expression of one's genes. It's what your genes show. So if you're a rabbit and you've got a darker colored phenotype, it means you got genes coding for darker colored fur. And I'm looking at the illustration here and I see that through the act of nature as a filter, filtering out those characteristics that don't contribute to survival and don't contribute to reproduction, allows the genes for darker colored fur to remain because those animals get to survive and those animals get to reproduce. And you look at the very bottom row of circles there and you see that the rabbit population over time is actually a darker colored rabbit because the lighter colored fur does not contribute to fitness. That's what natural selection is all about. This particular slide is worth its weight in gold. So, what is fitness? I hate to flog a dead horse, but fitness is a really, really important concept. It is not how smart you are, it's not how strong you are, it's not how fast you are. It is basically the ability to survive and reproduce. It is a term that is used to describe genes. It is a term used to describe phenotypes in the population. And if you're able to pass those genes on to future generations, that means you're passing those phenotypes on to future generations. Take a look at the illustration on the slide. You'll see Darwin's finches. These were birds that had beaks of different sizes and different shapes, and obviously the unique shape and size of the finch's beak allowed it to best monopolize the resources that were available to it. You might have a nice heavy beak. It would allow you to survive and reproduce, making more finches with a big heavy beak. You could have a small skinny little beak, which would be really, really good for eating insects. And that could improve your fitness. That could improve your ability to survive, your ability to reproduce, and as a consequence, you get a whole bunch of birds with teeny little skinny beaks. Just as well adapted as the birds with the big beaks. Variation is a consequence of this fitness that acts through natural selection to select for this variation in birds, variation in plants, variation in any other organism on the face of the planet.
There are distinct examples of natural selection from biology in a number of different respects. Let's take a look at some of these. First bullet point says drug resistance in bacteria. Most of us know that we treat bacterial infections with antibiotics. Antibiotics essentially kill bacteria, but they don't kill all of them. And so if a bacterium or two happens to survive treatment with an antibiotic, they probably have some genetic predisposition to resisting that drug. So they survive, they reproduce, and as time goes by, you can get varieties of bacteria that have that level of drug resistance. And this is one of the reasons why antibiotics becoming increasingly ineffective against certain bacterial infections, because those bacteria contain genes that have been selected for by this constant, or I'm going to say near constant, tendency of humans to treat bacterial infections with antibiotics. It seems to be an unavoidable result. Second bullet point, protective coloration and behaviors in animals. I'm thinking about chameleons, which are those cute little lizards that change colors. The basic idea here is the chameleons acquired these genes as time went by, but the fact is that predation pressure selected for those genes that allowed the animal to blend in with its surroundings, and therefore it gets to survive, and therefore it gets to reproduce, and therefore it gets to pass those genes on to future generations. Secondary metabolites in plants. In the course of doing their daily thing, staying alive, many plants do make some chemical compounds you don't find in other plants or in other plant species. And these metabolites oftentimes are obnoxious to herbivores, animals who would eat those plants. I am thinking of milkweed. Milkweed produces a white, milky material, which is a latex as a type of compound, and it gives other animals that eat it a tummy ache, to make it simple. And so therefore the milkweed lives its life and doesn't have to worry about other organisms eating on it. About the only organism I can think of that eats milkweed would be the monarch butterfly caterpillar. And in that case, the monarch butterfly caterpillar probably has co-evolved with the milkweed, so it's able to eat the milkweed and is not deterred at all by those secondary metabolites. Now, our final example here comes from us humans, and it's in our own backyard. It's called artificial selection. Now, artificial selection is a form of natural selection, at least in the sense that humans are determining which animals get to survive, and humans are getting to determine which animals reproduce. As a consequence, Case in point, you can look at dogs. There are a tremendous number of breeds in dogs. Big dogs, short dogs, long-haired dogs, short-haired dogs, dogs that are vicious, dogs that can swim, dogs that can do all sorts of things. And those different varieties of dogs, I mean, they're all the same species. All dogs belong to the same species, but the variation we see due to the selective breeding of those dogs is a consequence of literally thousands of years of human intervention. The same thing can be said for birds. The same thing can be said for crop plants. The same can be said for roses or flowers. Humans have been selectively breeding plants and animals for a very, very long time. And it is the decision making that involves which animals or plants get to survive, which animals or plants get to reproduce, has influenced the inheritance of those genes and the resulting variation in those species. Now, it's important to remember that the result of natural selection is not new genes. New genes can only arise through events of mutation. What happens as a consequence of natural selection and fitness, which is the ability to survive or the ability to reproduce, is changing allele frequencies or proportions in a population over time. And so if you change those allele or gene frequencies over time, that can ultimately have an influence on the morphology, the appearance, the physiology, the biochemistry, and behavior of those plants or those animals. If you take a look at the illustration at right, you will see a graph. And that graph shows me generations across the bottom, and it shows me frequency or percentages on the vertical axis. And as time goes by, you see that some of those lines go up and some of those lines go down. So after a large number of generations, what you see on the far right-hand side of that graph is a snapshot of the different genes and their proportions and the influences on their phenotypes that you would see after a serious amount of time. What you see there on the right would be an animal or plant species. That is the same species as the one we started off with at the far left, but as a group, it's going to look a little bit different because of those shifts in gene frequencies over time. So it's important to remember in our last bullet point here that natural selection as a mechanism exerts pressure on change in the population, large numbers of interbreeding individuals. It does not have an influence on the individual itself. Because when you think about it, the individual itself would either be able to survive and reproduce or not reproduce or not survive and not reproduce. And obviously that particular event affects one individual, but the actual result, the actual influence on evolution is realized not just by one individual, but by changes in millions and millions and millions of individuals over an extreme long amount of time. And so evolution is not something that occurs in an individual, it occurs in populations. Natural selection does not occur in an individual, it occurs in populations. And natural selection is the mechanism by which we change gene frequencies in a population. As a consequence, we see the change in that population after time goes by. So we've spent quite a bit of time during this presentation focusing on Darwinian evolution and the idea of natural selection, and I think we've got a pretty good idea of what's going on. I've got one more slide here that will have something to do with Darwinian evolution, and this involves the distinction between two types of evolution, one that we're going to call microevolution and the other is called macroevolution. Microevolution is largely what we've been talking about so far. Microevolution is changes in gene frequency within a species. If you change gene frequencies in a species of plant, if you change gene frequencies in the breeding of dogs, in the breeding of cats, what you're doing is you're changing gene frequencies in a species, but the identity of that species does not change. That's microevolution. There is absolutely no controversy associated with the notion of microevolution. Gene frequencies change within species. It has been witnessed. We have evidence to support that fact. It happens. Now, the second type of evolution, called macroevolution, is a little bit more thorny. Macroevolution is changes in gene frequency that result in new species. Macroevolution is sometimes also described as speciation, that is, the generation of new species through natural selection, and it is the type of evolution that invites a lot more controversy. So where do species come from? Well, it depends, obviously, if you've got a creationist mindset or if you've got an evolutionist mindset. As a rule, those who have an evolutionist mindset would essentially be inclined to say that species arise from pre-existing species, and the process of creating, or generating, I should say, those new species is through a process of macroevolution. It's the change in gene frequencies that lead to organisms that are significantly genetically different from their ancestors, and therefore results in a new species. Well, okay, let's wrap up this presentation about origins with two alternative views of the origins of life. One called theistic evolution and a second called intelligent design. Now, the deal is we have covered special creation, we've covered catastrophism, we've covered Lamarckian evolution, we've covered Darwinian evolution in great detail. And these are both non-scientific and scientific explanations of the origins of life and its diversity. Well, let's take a look at two non-scientific views. One is called theistic evolution. And best description I can have for theistic evolution, it is a combination of a special creation idea combined with Darwinian evolution. It's a notion that many scientists do have, that there was some kind of creative event. Some deity, god, or gods generated creative event that resulted in the life that we see on this planet. But the result of what we see after that creative event is the influence of natural selection and evolution, leading to this great variety of plants and animals that we see today. So it's kind of an agreeable coexistence of what is special creation and Darwinian evolution as an explanation of the variety of life that we see today. Now, in contrast, there is this other alternative view that is labeled as intelligent design. And the intelligent design, or the intelligent design argument, says that there is some kind of intelligence in the universe. Now, that's essentially code word for God. But the idea is there is this intelligence in the universe, and that intelligence is responsible for the intense designs we get in the evolution of all of these organisms. Case in point, an argument might be made that the eye, the human eye, could not possibly arise through this random set of serendipitous events that would have actually led to the evolution of the eye. You think about it, the eye would have to be the endpoint of a very, very, very long process of happenstance events, natural selection driven events that could ultimately lead to the formation of an eye. The analogy would be how could a watch possibly assemble itself if it were not for the fact there was some watchmaker who designed a watch, made the itsy witsy little pieces, and put them together to get a fully functional watch? You can't get a watch without a watchmaker. You can't get variation in biology without some degree of intelligence. Now, the thing is intelligent design was marketed early on in the 1980s, which is really when it had its heyday, as this scientific explanation for the origins of life. Well, it's really not scientific at all, because what it does is it still presupposes the existence of a God. Whatever intelligence is, it is a God. It is nothing more than a repackaged version of creationism. Now, I am not issuing some kind of statement as to whether that's right or it's wrong. It's not. It is not my place, and it's not your place to say someone is right or wrong in terms of these views of origins and variation of life. But the fact of the matter is if you've got some view about the origins of life, you make sure it's agreeable to you. My job in this course in biology is to make sure that you know what all the alternative views are, and the ones that are exclusively scientific, the ones might be partially scientific, or the ones that aren't scientific at all.